Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery preparing to check in on some European nightcrawlers that I launched off into a sort of special system. They came out of um, the initial haul out of just a few volunteer worms from the systems that used to reside in the yellow buckets. So I had 3 yellow buckets with European nightcrawlers in them, and then I wanted to migrate the worms out of their castings. So I placed all the material from the yellow buckets down into this large tub, did a horizontal migration, launched off some new systems. I even spent a little time to bait straggler worms out of the systems, and as of yesterday, this is now just a batch of nothing more than harvested castings in my book. Just sort of taking up space here on the shelf, so I got to empty that container so I can make room for new things. And the worms that came out of there, for the large part, ended up in these 2 black tubs over here. But like I said, prior to that happening, I did pull some volunteer worms out to do a little special project. And they're over here in this system. And this is the system I want to check in on today. It's been 12 days since we checked in on it. So once we get it up on the bench, I'll explain how it's a little bit of an oddity, a little bit of a experiment. So let's get up on the bench with that bin and see what's going on with these worms. So at first glance, you might think that the thing that sets this system apart from all the rest is the way it is the only system that I have which operates in a perforated system, so I can't turn it upside down, but this tray does have holes punched on the bottom to permit drainage. And as you can see, the deeper tray beneath it is where that excess moisture collects if it managed to pass through, and it generally does because I've been super generous with moisture in here, and that's intentional. But that's not really what sets this system apart. Once I've got it open, you'll probably be able to see what I'm referring to. But then again, you never know what the worms have done over the past 12 days. They could have altered the appearance of this system drastically, but that seems kind of unlikely. We don't have a whole lot of worms in here. This was meant to be a sort of a little test, a little trial, because I didn't quite know what to expect. And the trial was to see what becomes of these little boulders that I've been referring to these as. So, long story short, I took all of my collected castings that I've got in buckets, and I took it all and ran it through my screen. I ended up with a large quantity of really nice castings, and this stuff here would not pass through. I just did my best to crush it and break it up a lot, and eventually I ended up with this stuff as well as a whole bunch of other stuff that I keep around as a reminder that it's my suspicion that this stuff has got a good bit of this sort of debris in here. This is just little bits of synthetic materials that just won't break down, and I keep this around just to remind me that that was part of the reason I thought that this might result in us having all kinds of weird stuff floating in here should we manage to end up with material that no longer looks this way. I was thinking originally just to release the worms into this stuff and see what becomes of it, and that just seemed a little bit too risky. So to make sure the worms have at least a typical type of a bedding to live in, I placed a little landing pad of my prepared bedding down here, and then I released my 1 or 2 handfuls, I forget how much it was, but it certainly wasn't much, of worms into here to see what they make of this stuff. And I wanted them to be able to enter that material voluntarily. If they want to stay in this bedding here indefinitely, that's fine with me. But what I was kind of hoping for was that they would gradually adopt these boulders as something to possibly move into and ideally leverage as a food source. And during the first couple days after launching the system, at this point, let's see, 12 days ago we came in on day 7 originally last time, so 19 days since we kicked off this system, I checked in once or twice, mainly to continue adding abundant moisture, and then I found a couple signs of kind of worms venturing out to explore and then ending up either on the plastic cover and dying, or just out here on the surface of this stuff and dying, regrettably. So I started to panic, but after our last check-in 12 days ago, we started to see some indications that the worms might be possibly able to venture into this stuff, or at least go right up to the edge of it and utilize it as a food source. And that was what I was really hoping to see, was that they'd eventually work their way into this stuff, utilize it as a food source, and possibly transform it into useless little boulders, and maybe even transform it into just an everyday batch of castings. So I really don't know what to expect from this little experiment. What is this, a cherry pit? I typically exclude things like that from my systems because they're just going to take forever to break down. So it does seem like the worms are continuing to venture out to the edge of this little isolated island of easily inhabited material and kind of poking their nose into the questionable material, possibly making use of it as a food source. Presumably that's the reason they're heading there. There also seems to be a number of worms just remaining down in the center area. And there doesn't seem to be anything wrong with these worms. They seem to be okay. So I don't think there's any reason for concern. If I had gotten some sort of vibes during the last check-in 12 days ago, I wouldn't have just put this back on the shelf and ignored it for the past 12 days. I probably would have been back in here off camera on a couple occasions just to make sure things are not going haywire. But we're just going to continue with this experiment to see what becomes of it. But it does seem to me like this material is really not going to make any progress whatsoever unless it's kept extremely damp. So our main reason for wanting to come in here is to dampen all the stuff in here to the point where it'll just start seeping through and draining out. So let's get that underway here. And originally my thinking for this was that they don't need food because all of this stuff here is basically worm castings kind of clumped together and quite likely still retaining a good bit of nutritional value that the worms can make use of. But after 7 days of letting the system run, the first check-in was on day 7, 12 days ago. It seemed like let's not do it that way. Let's be a little bit more laid back and not think that we're going to be able to force our will on these worms to do what we're hoping. Let's put that possibility out there, and if they want to, they can, but I figured we might be better off providing them with a little haven in the middle in case the experiment is something that's just never going to really go the way I thought it might. And if need be, we can eventually just work their environment here in the center up to the point where it can sort of take over, and if need be, we can just end up removing all these boulders and try to make some use of them elsewhere. But looks like we're kind of losing pressure here on the squirt bottle. But I don't think we need to go much beyond this. This is typically the amount of moisture I come in here with, in the hopes that if we do dampen these boulders, they'll soften up to the point where the worms can actually, start taking them apart. And perhaps the other thing that's going to make it difficult to see if we're making any progress here is the very small number of worms with which we launched this little experiment. So, like I said, it's just kind of an unusual, weird little experiment that I even kind of announced last time we checked in here 12 days ago that I was kind of losing interest in. perhaps because I didn't really see much in terms of early positive results. But it does seem to me like, we should be able to proceed if we follow the approach that we've been following so far, which is to keep things damp, keep building out their space in the middle, just in case that ends up being the only place where they can really live and thrive and survive. And at some point, if we decide we're just going to abandon the little experiment with the boulders, we can certainly do that by keeping things more or less separate. We could always just sort of extract the center section and let the worms continue elsewhere as a more typical setup, and then, like I said earlier, just pull out these little castings, boulders, and try to put them to use somewhere if possible. So I've built out the system a little bit more in the center by adding some bedding and moisture, and now we're going to give them a little bit more of the types of foods we gave them last time. I think last time we gave them coffee, like we're giving them once again here. I don't recall if we used any of my worm chow last time, but I've got that here as well. And I really don't want to go overboard on feeding these little guys because there's so few of them. And if they could take advantage of this food that we just added, that's terrific. But my guess is that they could have done just fine if I never added any food at all, because the bedding itself always can serve as a suitable food for them as well. But I think the whole idea behind me breaking down and actually giving them typical worm foods in the form of coffee last time was just kind of further evidence that my interest in pushing this experiment hard was not really there, and it didn't seem like it was going to be worth it, especially if it puts the little worms in jeopardy. So we're just going to do this for fun, see what becomes of it, and I think I'll have to charge up my bottle here, give it a little pump, because it's not really dispensing moisture anymore. But we don't need it to because we're finished here. Let's get things covered up the way we had it and let it continue. It does almost seem to me like checking in as frequently as we have is almost unnecessary. We could probably go a longer period of time, but you know me, I'm the curious type. It would be hard for me to just stay hands off, unless of course I had some set it and forget it type systems, which I do. So maybe we'll be back in here at some point again in 10-12 days like we typically do. But that's it for the check-in, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.